Hi, I'm Vicky from So Fabulous Fabrics and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be making the Art Deco Wall Hanging. This comprises of two different log cabin blocks. So the top one and the bottom one are the off-centre log cabins and the two in the middle are the half log cabins. So that's what we will be making today. So let's get started. If you're going to make the log cabins using the foundation paper piecing, then this is the equipment that you will use to be able to do those two blocks. So first of all, I've got a piece of plastic to enable me to put a nice crease in the paper when we're folding it back for the FPP. You could use some stiff cardboard as well, but I've got some template plastic. I've got my ruler and I have got my seam roller, a glue stick, some tweezers to pull the paper off the back of the fabric, some paper cutting scissors, some fabric scissors. I've got a few clips there as well, just in case I need to clip some fabric to the paper. And I've got two rotary cutters. So I've got one which is for cutting the fabric and one which is for cutting the paper and the fabric away together when I finished the FPP little unit. Here are my four fabrics that I'm going to use today. These are all from Lewis and Irene. And then I have two copies of each of the block that we're going to do today. So I've got two copies of the Art Deco half log cabin. That's those ones. And then I have two copies of the off-centre log cabin, and these will need to be sellotaped together, so you've got two sheets of each. So I'm going to cut up this line here. Hopefully you can just about see it, it's quite faint, and then I'm going to stick it, I'm going to probably glue it to this line here. So the edge of this piece will sit on, hopefully you can see it, on the edge of this line here. So I will do those and I'll come back and we'll just have a quick look at that to make sure that you're okay with what I'm talking about. I have cut out my two half log cabin FPP patterns and I've just left a little border around the outside as well. This is because when I put the fabric on the top, I want to make sure that it's going to be covering this seam allowance. So having that extra little bit of paper border around the actual block itself will enable me to see that I've got the fabric over this area here where the seam allowance is. So I've got two of those that I've cut out, and then for the off-centre log cabin I've glued the two halves together, and again I've left a little border around the whole of the block. I've then cut two strips of each of my four fabrics, ready to start our FPP. For my foundation paper piecing tutorial, I'm going to try something a little bit different that I don't usually do. So I'm here actually at my sewing machine and I have a cutting mat on the top of the table that comes with the machine. So I have my first block for the FPP on the mat, and I have all of my fabrics just here which we're going to be popping onto the block. So the first one I have is this one, and we're starting with A1. So I need a piece that is going to cover the whole of A1 with a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the outside, covering this seam allowance here and just going into this little spare piece of paper that where we've cut around the block initially. So I'm just going to lay that at the side just to see where my piece goes, and then I will just snip that off there. And then I'm going to turn the paper to the other side. Take my glue stick, and where A1 is on the foundation paper piece paper, I'm just going to pop a little bit of glue on there, and then pop the fabric on the top, as I say, making sure you're covering all of those lines and the seam allowance line. Then turning that over, I have my piece of template plastic that I'm going to use to help crease this solid line here that goes between A1 and A2. So we'll do that first of all. Fold the paper over, just press it down with your finger. So you can either trim this fabric away to about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or leave it as it is. It's entirely up to you. What I'm going to do with the next piece of fabric, I'm going to put it against the first piece, right sides together, and then I will be flipping this piece of paper over and stitching along this solid line. So it doesn't matter either way if you leave that piece of fabric as it is like that, because you'll be cutting the excess away anyway, or if you want to trim it first of all. I like to trim mine first of all, so I'm just going to trim a small piece off there. And then I'm going to find my next piece of fabric that I'm going to use for A2. Which is going to be this one. And again, I'm going to cut another piece that's similar size to this first piece, as it's going to be another square that we're covering. But you also need to make sure that you've got enough to cover the 2 corners of seam allowance into the extra little bit of paper. So we should be okay. I have pre-measured these pieces of fabric, which you will find on the pattern the amounts that I have cut for this particular project. So that's the piece of fabric that's going to go to cover A2. So I will pop that right sides together onto the top of A1, and hopefully you will be able to see this printed square just underneath, which is on the right side of your FPP paper, and that you have got your seam allowance covered just here on this right hand side, and you've got a little bit overlapping on the left hand side. So I'm now going to stitch this on. So when I get to my machine, I will fold it open, and I've got my machine set at 1.5 stitch length, and I will do a little bit of back stitching into A3, stitch down this solid line, and a little bit of back stitching into the seam allowance space here. So my fabric and my paper are underneath the needle. So I've got the needle into the top of the paper and fabric, and I'm just going to do a couple of reverse stitches to start with, and then just stitch along that line. And a couple of stitches into where the seam allowance is, and reverse. There are our first two pieces of fabric stitched together. So that's how it looks on the front. We can see the stitching line there. So we'll just flip that back over, and then we will just finger press this across first of all, and then I like to get my seam roller and just give it a bit more of a press. Okay, so we've done A1 and A2, and we are now going to do A3. So we'll just find the fabric for that piece, and that one is going to be this one. So again, just give it a bit of a eyeballing measure and just cut another piece off. Before flipping it back over to put the next piece of fabric on, we want to place our piece of plastic just along that solid line that leads into A3. Fold back the paper, and because you've stitched into the next part of the pattern, you just need to pull your fabric away from the paper. The stitching stays in your fabric, but just pull it away from the paper to make it flat. And we'll just press that. And then again, I'm going to trim a 1/4 inch roughly there. I'm going to be very brave and do it freehand with my rotary cutter. You could use a ruler as well, or if you're leaving the excess there, then that's absolutely fine because you can trim it off afterwards. So I'm just going to trim that off there, and then I'm ready to pop the next piece of fabric on. So again, right sides together, making sure that that piece of fabric underneath is covering the seam allowance here on the right, and it's covering this line here with approximately about a 1/4 inch excess over this solid line. So again, when I get to the sewing machine, I will flip that open, and I'm going to stitch along that solid line. And I can now press that piece open. Flip that to the other side, and then we will be ready to do A4. So I'm going to carry on putting all the fabrics onto this piece, and then once it is finished, we'll come back and take a look, and we'll get it trimmed. Here is my first half log cabin block completed, and we'll just turn it over so you can just have a look at the back. I've kept the paper on for the moment, but I have trimmed the extra margin that I left all the way round. So I've trimmed that to the cutting line, which is also the that's the seam allowance there, but that's the cutting line just there. So I've got that ready and trimmed, and then I have my second half log cabin block all ready to stitch all my pieces of fabric on. So we'll just have another look at the front of that one. So there you can see, all nice and even and looks beautiful. We are now ready to do the off-centre log cabin block. So this one has two different widths of strips of fabric, as you can see. I have got all my fabrics prepared. I may need to cut more as I go along, but I always like to have a few strips cut off the fabric pieces first of all. I've also got the fabrics that are left over from the smaller block as well, so hopefully we can use some of those with some of the smaller pieces in the beginning. So I have those all ready to make a start, so I'll just pop those back down there. Now this is a 10-inch block, so as you move along it does get a little bit more fiddly, but you know it's still an easy block to do. I'm ready with my fabric scissors, my glue stick, my seam roller and a piece of fabric. Now because I'm using a fabric that's got some very clear motifs on it, and A1 on the 10-inch block is quite a large piece, I thought that I would pop this piece so as it sits nicely in the middle of that A1 shape. So just move those out of the way and flipping your FPP over to the back, just have a look at A1. Now because when we're going to construct the final project of the wall hanging, these pieces will sit in a certain way. So I'm going to be using this edge, so where the lighter fabrics are, as a focal point in my finished piece of work. So I thought it would be quite a nice idea, I'll just flip that back again, be easy to see, to have my piece of fabric in the middle of A1, actually on a slight angle I suppose. So when I was looking and deciding what I was going to do with this, I placed it sort of going across the diagonal. I don't suppose it would matter which way you did it, you could do it that way if you wanted to, but I quite liked having those lines going across the diagonal. So that's what I'm going to do when I come to stick it on the reverse of the pattern piece. So it might be a bit difficult for you to see at this moment because the lines obviously are quite faint through the paper, but we'll just pop some glue on there, and I am going to judge by eye to get this piece more or less in the middle of that square at the angle that I want it to be. So I think that might be more or less it. So I'm going to take my chances, and I've glued it down, and then we go back over, and then we are ready to place the piece for A2. There is my fabric that I'm using for A2, which is going to be attached to A1. So first of all, I shall just use my piece of plastic and press the paper over like we did on the smaller block, and just put a crease in there. Remove that, and then I am just going to trim off a bit of fabric, so I don't want all that excess. And then finding my second piece, I should just do a bit of eyeball measuring. And just cut that off. And then flip your piece over and pop that on the back, and making sure that you have covered the two lines either side of that piece of the block. And then when I get to the machine, I shall flip that over, and as we've done before, I will start a little bit off this solid line just here, back stitch into there, stitch down, and back stitch into there. There is my second piece stitched on. Before I flip it open and press it down, I'm actually going to just trim the seam allowance fabric a little bit. I don't want it to be too bulky because some of these pieces are quite small, so I'm just going to trim a little bit off that edge. And then we can just flip that one over and just press that open. Right, so then we're doing A3, so we'll just measure that. And then flipping that over. Oh no, first of all, beg your pardon, that's put me off a little bit. We just need to do the crease along that solid line. So let's do that first, because we do have, if you did the first one A1 as I did with cutting a bigger square to get that motif on the fabric in the middle, I've got quite a big piece there which I'm going to trim off first of all. So that's that, and then going back with my piece of fabric, pop that on the back, and then that will be ready to go to the sewing machine. I have moved on a little bit with the 10-inch block that we are stitching, so I need to find this little green fabric here, which is going to go along there, which is going to be A13. Once you have completed your log cabin blocks, then you're ready to trim them. So we'll just turn it to the back, and I have got my quilting ruler, and I've got my cutting rotary cutter that has got an old blade in it that I use for cutting through the paper, and it also cuts the fabric as well. So just taking a look at where the lines are. So this is will be your stitching line, and this is the seam. So we are going to be cutting on the faint line all the way round. So I'll make a start, and then I will get all 4 of them finished, and then we'll have a look at our finished blocks. I've removed the papers from 3 of the blocks, so there you can see on the reverse where all the papers have been taken off. So you've got a small one, and I have got the 2 larger ones, and then I have one left to do. I find the easiest way to remove the papers is to use a pair of tweezers. So first of all, I will just pull the paper away from where the stitching lines are. I usually do all the way round, like so, and then I will start pulling the fabric away until it gets to a point where I need to start peeling the paper off from the other side. So I'll just flip it over. So just tearing away the paper that I can, and that comes away quite easily. And then where it's stitched down, say like in this corner just here, I'm just going to use my tweezers and just lift the paper up slightly so as I can get at it a little bit easier, and then I can start pulling it away. I'm now ready to start piecing the wall hanging together. So I have cut out my background pieces. So these started as squares. I've got 2 of the smaller size and 2 of the larger size that are on the pattern, and I've cut them in half across the diagonal for each piece. So I have my 2 smaller log cabin blocks on my cutting mat, and I have laid on the top of each of them one of the triangles that I've cut in half from the square pieces which originally cut. So I'm just going to pop that into this left hand, or bottom corner should I say, just here, and this edge against the edge of the log cabin. So I'm going to be stitching along here with a scant 1/4 inch, and then exactly the same on the other one, stitching a scant 1/4 inch. So you can see that I have laid mine out with the lighter fabrics facing into the middle, but it's entirely up to you how you would like to do it. It'd be quite nice just to juggle around your pieces first before you carry on stitching the background fabrics on, so just to give it a different look. So I'm going to get those 2 done, and then when I come back we're going to fold this open and press it, and then we're going to stitch the other pieces on to these straight edges here. Once you have stitched one of the triangles onto one edge of the small log cabins, you'll just need to press the seams over. So I've pressed my seams over onto the log cabin. With the second triangle and one of the blocks we've just completed, I'm going to stitch this on, placing that in that corner. And I'm going to use again a scant 1/4 inch and stitch it right across to that edge. Once I've sewn on the second triangle, just flip that over and I'm just going to press it flat. And then you can see at the top I've got a little tail just there, which I'm just going to snip off. And if I unfold that again, you can see there's an extra bit of fabric here as well. So to reduce the bulk, I'm just going to cut that bit off as well, just to where the seam ends. And then moving on to one of the larger log cabins, we're then ready to put some of the bigger triangles onto this piece. So taking one triangle, fold it in half and get your edges together and just put a crease in the top. And then with this bottom edge, again, I'm going to fold my square over, get the edges together and just put a crease in there as well. So then I'm going to lay my triangle on top of this log cabin, matching these two creases together. Just grab my pins. So find where your two creases go and pop a pin in there. And I'm going to stitch that along there, along that top part of the block with a scant 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to press it open. There is the other triangle stitched on at the bottom of the block or the wall hanging. So I'm just going to press that open like we have done before. As we did with the smaller block, I'm just going to trim this excess bits of fabric off. Next, to complete the first half of our wall hanging, we are then going to stitch this piece onto here. So matching the edges just here by flipping it over, put some pins in or clips, whichever you prefer, and we are going to stitch a scant 1/4 inch along this line all the way to that point at the end. There is the first half of our wall hanging completed. I'm going to carry on making the other half of the hanging using the same steps as I've already described in this video. And then we'll come back and we'll look at how we're going to join the two halves together. There are the two halves of the wall hanging completed. So now we need to stitch them together. So finding where the middle point is. So this is my middle point, these two seams just here. I'm going to flip that one over and then I'm going to nest those two seams together in the middle. So I'm going to pop a pin in there first of all, and then I'm going to go along and clip together the rest of the seams, and then I'll be stitching it together with a scant 1/4 inch. Once you've stitched the two halves together and pressed the seams, then you are ready to just trim round the edges, make sure it is all straight, and then after that it is time for the quilting. So I have my finished wall hanging laid out ready for quilting. So I have basted it together with a backing fabric and then some wadding, and then with the wall hanging on top. So we've in effect got a quilt sandwich. I've used some spray glue for sticking all the layers together, but I've also put some basting pins in as well. So I'm going to quilt mine stitching the ditch. So I'll probably start doing the outlines first, and then I will go alternate strips in. Once you've finished quilting your wall hanging, it's ready then to put the binding on. So I have prepared my binding here, and I'm going to trim around the edge of the wall hanging and then stitch the binding on. You can see on the back where I have done the quilting as well. Just thought I would show you that. So that's going to be the last job to do. Coming up next is a video tutorial that I made for the sunflower wall hanging on how to prepare and stitch on your binding. We're now going to put the binding on our mini quilt. So first of all, you need to measure all 4 edges of your quilt and add on 10 inches. You'll then need to cut your strips from your chosen fabric. I'm doing mine 2.5 inches wide, and for my mini quilt I'm going to need 70 inches worth of binding. So I've got 2 strips of fabric here on the table because I've cut it off the width of the bolt, and I'm using the bumbleberries. Now on the Rudy the reindeer wall hanging I did before Christmas, I found a new, or a different, should I say, technique of joining your binding pieces together. So I'm going to show you how to do that again today. I thought it was a really good way of doing it, and actually I found it a much more accurate way when I folded the pieces in half to press them. So you're going to need your quilting ruler if you've got one, and you need to find the 45-degree angle which is on your ruler. So this is mine here. So place that line, that 45-degree line, on the edge of your binding fabric. Now I've got 2 pieces together here because I'm going to cut through 2 pieces. And then at the end you need to find where the intersection is for 1/4 inch. So mine is just there, so that's the quarter of an inch square, if you like, just there. And you need to place that point on the bottom edge of your binding. And then next what we're going to do is we're going to trim off that triangle that's on the end there. So there you've got your 2 pieces. And then how it's going to work is taking your 2 ends, you're going to place them, let's get that round the right way, so they are right sides together, and then you have got then your 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew down that edge. So I'm going to do that on the sewing machine using my 1/4 inch foot, and we'll come back and have a look. And I'm going to press it open as well, ready for stitching onto the wall hanging. There are the 2 pieces of binding stitched together, and I've ironed the seam allowance flat. So you can see when you look on the front, you haven't got any of those little tails that you normally have when you're stitching your binding pieces together. And it's nice and even along the edges, which is fantastic. So I have gone along as well and pressed my binding in half all the way. And it's now ready to stitch onto our mini quilt. I'm going to go ahead and stitch my binding on, and then when we get to near the end of it, I'm going to come back and show you how I'm going to finish it off. I'm going to use a slightly different method this time to deal with the ends of the binding than we did on the Rudy wall hanging. You'll need to leave about 5 inches of binding unstitched on both ends, and I've got about a gap of 8 inches unstitched here. So what you'll need to do is lay one piece of your binding down, and I'm just going to pop it off the edge slightly so I can see it when I come to do my bit of measuring. Lay your other piece on top, and then whatever width you've cut your binding fabric, as mine is 2.5 inches, the easiest way to do it is, if you've got a spare piece like I have here, is place that on the edge of where the binding begins. So that's why we've just got that little bit sticking out slightly so we can see it a bit better. So pop that on there, and then using some sort of marker pen or whatever you use to mark your fabric with, just draw a line along that edge there on the right. Now if you draw it along on the left and you cut your fabric off there, you'll find that your binding's not long enough. So make sure you do it to the right of this piece of binding. So you're using the width of this because this is the width of the binding that you've just sewn on. And then you need to snip that piece off. So to attach the 2 pieces of binding together, I'm going to just press, or finger press, this fabric across, which will then form a line across the middle, which I'm going to use as my stitching line when I get to the machine. So I'm just going to finger press that. And then taking your 2 ends of binding, pop them right sides together. This is probably the most difficult part, I think, because the fabric is fighting against each other where it's been stitched on and you want to carry on stitching it. Okay, so I'm just going to pop some pins along that line that I've just pressed a crease. And then I will go and sew that on the machine, and we'll come back and see how it looks. So there is the seam pressed open on the inside, and that fits along there perfectly. So I'm now ready just to finish the stitching all the way along here, and then that's the binding attached. Once I finish that, I'm going to turn it over to the back. Let's have a look at this side. and you could either stitch in the ditch along this line, catching the binding on the reverse, or you could do some hand stitching. I think I'm probably going to do some hand stitching. So once it's all finished, we'll come back and have a look.